So you've written a research paper, and now we're going to get into writing a speech. And there are some similarities between these two, but there are also a lot of differences. So hopefully you've already thought about some of the similarities and differences, as well as hopefully you've already read this article by John Coleman about speeches versus essays. So I'm just going to talk through some of the similarities and differences that Coleman points out, as well as adding some of my own. So first we'll start out with things from the article that you read. And research papers can be very complex. They can be subtle and nuanced, which means there can be slight differences, very detailed explanations, and they can have very detailed statistical analyses. And they can do this because in a paper, the reader can always go back and reread a section if he or she doesn't understand something. Speeches, on the other hand, do not give the audience a chance to go back. Once an audience has heard something, they can't just pause you, rewind, and re-listen to something if they miss it. So speeches should be much more simple than a paper. Not that you can't talk about difficult and complex topics, but you need to simplify it so that the audience can understand. Speeches should also be concise. So try not to go off on tangents, try not to use a lot of extra detailed language and long sentences. It's best for speeches to have short and simple sentences instead. They should also have an obvious organization, so transitions should be much more apparent in speeches than in research papers. So a speech might come right out and say, "Today I'm going to talk to you about," whereas in a research paper you should never write, "This paper will be about." With speeches you can do that. In speeches, you have the opportunity to punctuate your words with your voice, your vocal expression, your facial expression, as well as your gestures to help communicate your meaning. Speeches can include stories, and they can also be informal, whereas research papers won't be. So those are some of the big differences that Coleman points out in his article. But I want to point out a few differences in addition to that. So research papers must be based on research, whereas speeches can include research, but they don't necessarily have to include research. It really depends on the purpose of your speech. And in both research papers and speeches, if you do use sources, you need to give credit to the sources, but it's going to look different in each. So in research papers, you'll follow MLA guidelines or whatever guidelines you choose to follow or you're instructed to follow, whether that's APA, Chicago, or whatever. But there's a specific way you have to give credit to the sources. Whereas with a speech, it can be a lot more laid back. We use what's called verbal references. So according to, or so-and-so says, and you use some of those phrases within research papers, but there's not that specific rule of you have to use what's first in the works cited page. In a speech, if you want to give credit to the organization instead of the author, or if there's no author, you don't have to use the article title. You just need to show in some way that the information that you're using came from a source. In research papers, you need to use formal academic language. Avoid the word you and I and personal stories. However, in speeches, that can be very powerful. You should use a conversational tone to try to connect more with the audience. If you speak with formal academic language, you might actually hurt the impact of your speech. So in a speech, you may use the word you because you are speaking to an audience and referring to them. Just make sure when you use the word you mean the people that you're actually referring to. Now, both research papers and speeches can be informative. Both can be persuasive. Speeches could also be entertaining or inspiring, whereas research papers wouldn't have that purpose. In both research papers and speeches, you should consider your audience and purpose. with all the decisions you make and throughout your process of writing the paper or preparing the speech. And you should follow the whole writing process. It takes a lot of work to write a quality paper and perform a quality speech. And going through that process without taking shortcuts is extremely beneficial. And both take a lot of work to do well. So there are definitely a lot of similarities and differences between research papers and speeches, but I want you to keep in mind that preparing a speech is very different than writing a paper. So even if you were assigned a paper in a speech and you were basing your speech off of your paper, you wouldn't be able to just jump from one to the other. It would take some work to get there. I have a few questions I want you to think about. If we were in the classroom, you would have a group discussion about this. So if you want to pause the video at all through these next few slides, just so you can think more, please go ahead and do that, because part of what I want to do is stimulate your thinking in this. So the first question is, how could your process for preparing impact a speech? Try to think of specific examples to support your response. You can pause the video if you need more time to think. Here's what I would say. Your process for preparing will have a huge impact on the quality of your speech. The more you practice, the more you prepare, the better you'll know your material, and that's going to impact your confidence as a speaker. So it will impact how you feel. And as you are more confident, you will deliver the speech better. So then the audience will have a bigger impact on them based on your words. You'll have a more powerful message if you are more prepared. Next question, is it better to write the speech first or make your slides or visual aid first? Why? If you need to pause the video, go ahead. I would argue that it's much better to prepare the speech first, to write it first, and then make the slides or visual aid next, because the visual aid is not your speech. It's supposed to help your audience either understand the speech better or become more engaged in it. And if you do the visual aid first and then write the speech based off the visual aid, then the focus of your speech will be the visual aid and not you and not your words. So I would caution you against making slides first. I know that some people do that. Some people can pull it off, but sometimes it just makes for a poorer quality speech. So in this next part of the video, we'll talk about a process for preparing a speech. I know some of you have a lot of speaking experience and probably don't need this instruction. So if that's the case, you can stop the video here. However, if you don't have a whole lot of experience, or if you just want to know more about a process for preparing a speech, please continue to watch. I will say that everybody has their own process. So just as we all have a slightly different writing process, we might have a different process for preparing a speech. And that process might vary depending on the type of speech or the situation that you are in. But this process is one that I would use if I was going to prepare a formal speech. So the first thing is to know expectations. Know what you're supposed to be talking about. Know who your audience is and what they expect from you. You should know what your time frame is, because if your audience expects you to speak for 10 minutes and you speak for 20, they'll be annoyed. If they expect you to speak for 10 minutes and you speak for 2, they might feel like they got shortchanged. So know what they expect. That doesn't mean you have to do exactly what's expected, but knowing those expectations can help you make good decisions throughout your process. And you need to choose a topic. Sometimes the topic's given to you, sometimes it's not. So choose a topic that will work well for you, but also work well for your audience. And then write a draft. Even if you're not going to have a full speech in front of you when you give the speech, I highly, highly recommend writing out what you plan to say. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to read your speech to your audience. You shouldn't do that. But by writing it out, you can think through the connections between your ideas and think about how you might word them as you were speaking. And as you write your draft, try to think about how you would say the sentences versus how you would write it in a formal paper. And so what you might want to do is talk out some of your ideas and then maybe record yourself and transcribe it would be an option as well. So write a draft. And then especially if time is an important factor in your preparation, I would read your speech out loud and time it, just so you know if you're within the expectations for your speech. That way you can add or delete things as necessary. And then give feedback. Maybe have somebody read your written speech or give yourself some feedback as to, especially considering like your introduction, your conclusion, how your ideas connect. Then make cue cards, if any. So those are the note cards that you'll use when you give a speech. You don't have to use note cards. You might be able to use a full manuscript. And I do have links to that I'll provide you with for advice on using cue cards, using a manuscript, or giving a speech without any notes. But when you make cue cards, I highly recommend just writing down notes that will help you remember what you're going to talk about next. You don't have to memorize your speech word for word. Instead, you can try to memorize the structure of your speech and then just talk about each section of the speech. Have a conversation with your audience. And then make your visual aid, if any. So if you decide that a visual aid is beneficial for your speech, make that with the audience in mind. And then practice using the cue cards, practice using your visual aid, practice out loud. Get feedback from people as you practice, and then practice some more. And the more you can practice in a way that's similar to the actual performance, the more effective that practice will be in building your confidence and your ability to impact your audience. So here's a process for preparing a speech. You don't have to do all these steps. You don't have to do them in this order, but I think this is a good place to start as far as thinking about how to prepare a speech. So just a few big things to remember in speech preparation. Know yourself, know your speech and your audience, and do what you need to do. If you have questions, please let me know. Good luck on all your public speaking experiences in the future.